I would say that at least in the US, and I think even globally, there's one theme that's very common. Number one, risks aren't going away. Risks aren't lowering. There's not less risk. There's more risk. So, and the new risks come from different sources. So the new risks come from new innovative products, new innovation in terms of technology. So as we look over the risk landscape within our financial institutions, we're really starting to look at the expansion of risk and the need to control those expanded risks. So where those risks come from? Well, obviously, different ways of doing things, right? Different ways of trying to skirt the system and launder money. Different technologies that allow our the criminal elements to leverage those different new technologies to do or to put a lot more pressure on financial institutions to be able to identify the risks that are emerging. We're seeing new technologies that are bringing new products as well that bring on risks. Crypto, for example, exchange-related risks. So all those new payment rails are bringing together with themselves new risks. And then obviously the national priorities have obviously in the US have changed, and in other countries are changing as well as we see these different new patterns in terms of, new things that the criminal elements are coming up with. So risk is moving in different ways across different fronts. So that's number one. The other thing that we're seeing is the response to the regulator, the regulatory response to all of this. So as you can understand, with the increase in the technology from the criminal elements, then there is obviously the regulator's view as to, well, financial institutions should be leveraging these new technologies as well to defend themselves. So there is a purposeful response from the regulators indicating that financial institutions should look at automating a lot of their process, look at using these new technologies to find these emerging risks more and more. And in the US in particular, there is a very focused view, and not only in the US, but I mean globally, there's always been a view as to the risk assessment process. So the risk assessment has always been seen as being at the heart of developing your compliance program, but it was always seen as a recommendation from the regulators. But in FinCEN's recent proposed rulemaking, they really are recognizing that the risk assessment process is at the heart of the design of your risk, of your compliance program. So they are now moving to make the risk assessment a mandatory element within the scheme of all of the tools that you have, within the set of tools that you have as a financial institution to be able to manage risk. And we were seeing that, and it's one of the reasons why we were developing RiskRator over the last couple of years. We were seeing that the regulator was clearly making a move, or clearly indicating that the risk assessment is what informs your program. It's the basis for everything you do. And the better you are at making that risk assessment, the better you are at understanding where your risks are as a financial institution. And it's clear. I mean, when you look at the FFIEC examination manual and their procedures, the first thing that they do in the scoping exercise is they come in and they look at your risk assessment. And why do they do that? Because that risk assessment is supposed to inform that examiner as to where the risks in the organization are. And then they go in and they judge whether that risk assessment was a proper risk assessment. And if it wasn't, if it wasn't done using a proper methodology, they would come in and do their own risk assessment before even carrying out the examination. So it was clear, and it has been clear, that the risk assessment informs everything you do in terms of the knowledge of the risk that you have within your organization. So we have been really focused on designing RiskRator to really measure adequately all the risks that a financial institution has across all of the different categories and all of the risk events within the institution, so that any financial institution can clearly not only understand what their risks are, but be able to mitigate those risks and in an adequate way, report those risks and inform management, regulators, correspondent banks that they may have, inform them of the risk profile of their institution and the fact that they are adequately mitigating those different risks as they arise within their institution. really measure adequately all the risks that a financial institution has across all of the different categories and all of the risk events within the institution, so that any financial institution can clearly not only understand what their risks are, but be able to mitigate those risks and in an adequate way, report those risks and inform management, regulators, correspondent banks that they may have, inform them of the risk profile of their institution and the fact that they are adequately mitigating those different risks as they arise within their institution. A lot of hurdles, a lot of pain, a lot of struggle, a lot of time spent trying to convince my compliance officer that a relationship was worth taking on. So a little bit of background. I spent about 30 years working at international banks. I covered the international business of both clients downstream in Latin America and the Caribbean and in Florida. So my client base was US-based banks working in Latin America, Latin American banks, and banks throughout the Caribbean as a correspondent banker for many of a few of the major US banks that are the typical correspondent banks that you can find in this space. So a couple of things that were really a struggle. Number one was, whenever we wanted to open up a correspondent bank relationship and actually monitor an ongoing relationship, it was really important for us to clearly understand what risk was that financial institution bringing to us if we were to onboard them, right? And if they were going to be one of our clients. And it was always an analysis that was done interviewing their compliance manager, maybe asking for some reports from their auditors, trying to get a bird's eye view as to what are the specific risks that this institution is facing, and whether they have an adequate program in place, whether the compliance officer knows what he's doing, whether they have the team in place. But it was always kind of like a conversation and some evidence that was documentary. And I always wondered, wow, it would be great if they had a tool to be able to show us, right? To show us what the risk of the institution were, what the profile of the bank was. It would make it much easier to tell the story. That was number one of the considerations that as I was meeting with these banks, I always thought, wow, it would be really interesting if they had something to be able to tell this story. The second thing that I think was clear was that the financial institutions that were providing these services were already, really getting together and trying to understand what they as a group would be looking for. So you had the development of the Wolfsburg questionnaire with a whole bunch of requirements that were there as a baseline for the minimum requirements that an institution should have. And I saw that in evolution. But I also, unfortunately, saw and lived through situations where perhaps our bank didn't mitigate those risks themselves adequately, and what that would do to a financial institution in terms of their interaction with the regulator, possible fines, orders to improve your risk program. And at several institutions that I worked, unfortunately, not particularly in my area, but perhaps in other geographical areas, there were some observations that really put a freeze on the business. Really, it really hurt the business because we were spending so much time fixing things that we weren't really, expanding our business. So, and this is a challenge that most banks have, right? So, if you do not do things correctly, if you do not mitigate risk, if the regulators come and see that your program is not adequate, then there are fines. I mean, there's no way around it. They will fine you. They will put orders. They would implement orders against you to shore up your programs. And at the heart of all of this process was the risk assessment. If you didn't do a proper risk assessment and you didn't identify the risk properly, then how did you know what you needed to put in place? How did you know what you needed to control? So that to me was a striking piece, that the risk assessment really was the key to all of this. So I think when we finally got together with all the founders and started designing this, we in fact went out and we spoke to all the correspondent banks. We actually showed them what we were doing. We got their feedback. We looked at their requirements. We showed them what we were developing so we could come up with something that was really meeting their requirements. And then we also, not only within the design of RiskRator, put in place a lot of elements that would help a bank measure their risk and identify opportunities for improvement. But would also allow them to tell that story to their correspondent banks and tell that story to their committees and the regulators as well. Well, thankfully, we have a great story to tell. And I think, we spent a lot of time making sure that RiskRator really gave them a lot of tools and a lot of value. And the feedback from the clients has been 100% positive. So all of our clients are recurring customers. They are very, very pleased with several things. The first thing is the risk assessment process is difficult, right? It is not an easy process. It takes a long time getting all the data together, making sure that data is fine, collecting that data, running those through what today in most cases are Excel spreadsheets, because the medium and small banks actually deal with this in an Excel spreadsheet. And it takes them months to do this sometimes, at least 6 weeks. I mean, at a minimum, it takes 6 to 8 weeks to be able to put all of this data together. We can do this in a very, very short period. I mean, we can bring this down by 70, 80% in some cases, number one. So the time it takes to do the risk assessment is brought down dramatically. So, and of course, costs. Number two, methodology. A lot of the institutions, and it's been an interesting learning process for me as well. When we have our demos, a lot of institutions come back and say to us, well, I don't know if we have a proper risk assessment in place today. So they struggle with methodology. And we've built a methodology, and the methodology behind RiskRator has been a methodology that's been, built by one of our co-founders over 25 years. So it includes all of the guidance. It's been tested by regulators. It's been looked at. And in fact, we were fortunate enough to present our solution to FinCEN and to the regulators within the US and got their feedback saying that, our methodology follows the way that they believe a risk assessment should be carried out, which is a bottom-up approach based on true data. So we take data, we take your institution's data, and we use that to feed into our model. So when we calculate risk across your organization, we're doing a very quick, a very specific mathematical calculation of hundreds of thousands of calculations that really measures risk within your organization exactly. And that's another key element. So those are two things. The third thing that people love about the risk assessment, I'll point out two more things. The third thing I would say is we've changed the risk assessment process today from a backwards looking process. Because today, what do? You basically, as a financial institution, cut off after typically a 12-month period. You do your cutoff, and then you start writing your risk assessment about what happened. There's no opportunity for improvement in that process, right? You basically take a backward look at what you did right, and unfortunately, you also take a backward look at what you did wrong. And then you have to basically write up a summary of what you've done right, but unfortunately, you also have to write up a summary of what you did wrong. So there's no opportunity to clean that up, right? What we did with RiskRator was we said, well, the risk assessment should be at the end of this process. And we will allow you to run, at least in our base proposition, you can run quarterly risk assessments because we've made it much easier to run. You don't have to take 6 to 8 weeks to do this. The initial setup may take a couple of weeks, but going forward, it'll just take a couple of days to run your data through our tool and get a new risk assessment. So that way you can do this every quarter. And then our software gives you recommendations. So the recommendation engine will tell you this is where you are, this is what you did right in this quarter, this is where risk is moving within your organization, and here are some additional mitigating steps that we recommend that you take. So there's some recommendations in our recommendation engine, which clients love because they can clearly point out, okay, how do I take care of this risk? And we clearly say, well, if you want to take care of this specific risk event, you should be implementing these changes or these controls. And then on top of that, we model the effect of those changes going forward. So if you were to put in place those changes, what RiskRator does is it actually tells you, well, this is what you can expect in terms of improvements over time by implementing those recommendations. So they love this modeling and recommendation process because every quarter they focus on certain ones that we point out. So we've pointed out where the areas for improvement are, and then they go in and they mitigate. And then they run the next quarter. And then in the next quarter, you get a different set of things that you need to help improve. And so it's this constant improvement methodology that we've put in place that really, really has been welcomed by by our clients as a key differentiator. The last thing that I would point out is we have put in very robust reporting tools. So whenever you run a risk assessment, you have a complete set of reports, graphs, pie charts, a business intelligence module that allows you to slice and dice your data. And many people know you're typically in a compliance area, you don't get a business intelligence tool. It normally goes to the marketing and sales teams. That's where they invest on these BI tools. But we've given you a BI tool embedded within our solution. Clients love that as well because today, if you're doing it Excel based, you have to download the data, you have to create a pie chart, you have to cut and paste that into your reporting, and then you put it into a report. But our tool gives you full reporting capabilities, full BI capabilities. You'll be able to create your storyboards for your management team and be able to clearly show how throughout the year you've mitigated risk. And then the beauty of all of this is that story, every story that you're telling throughout every quarter and every process that you've taken is saved in our history. So when the regulator comes, you can clearly tell the regulator, here is what I found, here is what I did, here's how I improved, here's my next step to improve even further, and this is where I am today. So I think clients have really given us extremely positive feedback at our process, at being able to move this into a risk management process versus unexperienced writing a report at the end of an expired opportunity. Thank you, Marcus, for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.